Matthew reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers with ease. "In the best way," he replied, his voice warm and steady. "A year ago, I didn't think I'd ever feel this kind of happiness again." And now, his words trailed off as his gaze fell to Oliver, who let out a joyful squeal as though he agreed. The city glowed with a cold brilliance only winter could bring, its streets alive with the energy of New Year's Eve. Laughter, fireworks, and the buzz of celebration filled the air. But high above it all, Matthew Cooper stood alone in his penthouse, staring out at the skyline. The reflection in the glass mirrored a man who had everything, yet felt hollow inside. It had been 2 years since his wife, Isabel, had passed, a loss that had drained his once vibrant world of its warmth. The silence in his sprawling home was deafening, a stark contrast to the laughter that had once echoed through its halls. To the outside world, Matthew was the epitome of success, a billionaire CEO who commanded boardrooms and built empires. But behind closed doors, he was a man lost in grief, struggling to find purpose in a life that no longer felt like his own. Last year, in a rare break from his routine, Matthew had ventured out on New Year's Eve. It was a decision he hadn't made lightly, pushed into it by his well-meaning assistant, who had insisted he needed to do something, anything that might spark joy again. Skeptical but willing, he had wandered into a small, unassuming bar nestled on a quiet corner of the city. That's where he met her. The bar had been warm, lively, and chaotic in a way that felt strangely comforting. Matthew had taken a seat at the far end of the counter, content to observe the crowd and nurse his drink in solitude. But his plans to stay anonymous were disrupted when the bartender slid a second drink toward him, gesturing to a woman seated a few stools away. "You look like you needed it more than I did," she'd said, raising her glass in a playful toast. Her name was Samantha, and there was something about her, something that made the noise of the bar fade away. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, trading stories, jokes, and glimpses into their respective pasts. Samantha had walked away from a toxic relationship, a decision that left her questioning who she was and what she wanted. Her candor resonated with Matthew, though he didn't fully open up about Isabel. Even so, Samantha seemed to understand his silences in a way that few people could. As the night wore on, they laughed at the absurdity of two strangers finding such a deep connection in a crowded bar. When the clock struck midnight, they clinked glasses and exchanged a moment of unspoken understanding. "How about this?" Samantha had said. "Same time, same place, next year. If we're both still single, we'll meet here again." Matthew had chuckled, thinking it was a whimsical suggestion, but the sincerity in her eyes gave him pause. "Deal," he'd said, raising his glass one last time. The night hadn't ended there. One drink turned into 2, then 3, and before long, they found themselves sharing a cab to Matthew's penthouse. What followed was a night of passion and connection that made him forget, if only briefly, the ache of the past 2 years. By morning, Samantha was gone, leaving behind nothing but a faint trace of her perfume and the memory of her warmth. Now, as another New Year's Eve approached, Matthew found himself unable to stop thinking about her. He replayed their conversations over and over, caught between the hope of seeing her again and the fear of being disappointed. What if she wasn't there? What if she was, but the spark was gone? "Go," his sister Claire had said over the phone earlier that evening. "You've spent too long burying yourself in work, Matthew. If she made you feel something, even for a moment, you owe it to yourself to find out." Claire had always been his rock, pulling him out of the darkest corners of his grief and reminding him that life didn't stop just because Isabel's had. Her words carried weight, but the decision wasn't easy. Finally, as the hours ticked closer to midnight, Matthew found himself pulling on a navy suit, his movements deliberate and almost automatic. He couldn't bear the thought of letting another year slip by without at least trying. The bar was exactly as he remembered it. Warm light spilled from its windows, music and laughter spilling into the frosty air. Stepping inside felt like stepping into a memory, the familiar hum of the room wrapping around him like a well-worn coat. And then, in the midst of the crowd, he saw her. Samantha stood near the bar, holding a glass of wine in one hand and a baby in the other, The sight sent a jolt through him. Time seemed to slow as he took in her smile, still radiant, and the infant nestled in her arms. Questions swirled in his mind, but before he could process them, Samantha turned, locking eyes with him. "Matthew," she said softly, her voice carrying across the noise like a melody he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. His breath caught. He didn't know what had brought her back or what the baby in her arms meant, but one thing was certain. His life was about to change forever. Matthew's eyes roamed the room, his heart pounding as he searched for a familiar face. Samantha wasn't there. Not yet, anyway. Sliding into the same seat he had occupied the year before, he ordered a drink and set it before him, untouched. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the glass as the minutes crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last. Midnight was still an hour away, but the anticipation was unbearable. A sudden burst of laughter from across the bar jolted him. For a moment, his heart leapt, until he turned and realized it wasn't her. Just another stranger, caught in their own celebration. He exhaled, his shoulders sinking under the weight of disappointment. Maybe he shouldn't have come. Maybe the connection they'd shared had been nothing more than a fleeting moment, meant to fade as quickly as it had sparked. But even as doubt gnawed at him, something deeper refused to let go. The promise they'd made, no matter how improbable, felt like an anchor, holding him in place. The clock above the bar ticked steadily toward midnight, and Matthew stared at it as though willing the minutes to move faster. Around him, the sounds of the bar blended into an indistinct hum. Bursts of laughter, clinking glasses, the soft murmur of conversations. None of it mattered. His focus was locked on one thing, Samantha. The bartender approached, a wiry man with a sharp but friendly smile. "Need a refill?" he asked, nodding toward Matthew's glass. Matthew shook his head. "No, I'm good. Just waiting." The bartender chuckled knowingly. "Aren't we all?" he said, before moving on to the next patron. The seconds dragged on, and Matthew's thoughts drifted to the conversation with his sister that morning. Claire had called, her tone half teasing and half serious. "So," she'd said, "what's the plan for tonight? Don't tell me you're spending New Year's buried in spreadsheets again." "I'm considering it," Matthew had replied, his voice defensive. "I just don't know if I should go." "Considering it," she'd scoffed. "Matthew, it's one night. One promise. You're overthinking this because you're scared." "Maybe I am," he admitted. "But what if she's not there? Or worse, what if she is, and everything's different?" Claire's tone softened. "Everything is different, Matthew. That's life. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. You deserve something good, even if it's just one night." Her words echoed in his mind as the clock ticked closer to midnight. If Samantha wasn't there, he could live with the disappointment. What he couldn't live with was the regret of not showing up. Then the door opened, and everything seemed to stop. Samantha stepped inside, her coat dusted with snow, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She looked almost exactly as he remembered, soft curls framing her face, her warm smile cutting through the haze of doubt that had clouded his mind. But there was something different, something he hadn't prepared for. In her arms, bundled in a blue blanket, was a baby. Matthew froze, his chest tightening as a rush of emotions flooded in. Shock, confusion, and something deeper he couldn't yet name. The glass in his hand suddenly felt too heavy. Every scenario he'd rehearsed dissolved into uncertainty. She hadn't noticed him yet. Samantha moved toward a corner table, adjusting the baby in her arms with practiced ease. Her expression was hopeful, but tinged with nervousness, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. The smile that spread across her face was unmistakable. "Matthew," she said, her voice carrying over the din of the bar as she approached. The sound of her voice grounded him in a way he hadn't felt in years. The baby in her arms gurgled softly, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Rising slowly, his movements hesitant, Matthew met her halfway. "Samantha," he said, his voice uneven, as though testing the name after so long. And in that moment, he knew life had just taken another unexpected turn. "Samantha," he said, his voice catching in his throat. "You're here?" "Of course I am," she replied, her smile widening, though there was a flicker of something beneath it. Nerves, perhaps, or uncertainty. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted, his eyes flickering to the baby in her arms. "It's good to see you." Her smile faltered, as if she sensed the unspoken question hanging between them. Glancing down at the baby, she tightened her hold, her arms instinctively protective. "This is Oliver," she said softly. "My son." The words struck him like a blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He searched her face for an explanation, but her expression remained calm, though tinged with an almost apologetic sadness. "You have a son," he finally managed, his voice quieter than he intended. Samantha nodded, her smile turning bittersweet. "Yes, he's 3 months old." Matthew felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. A flood of questions surged in his mind, but he couldn't seem to find the words to ask any of them. The one question that burned the brightest, the one that loomed above all the others, stayed stubbornly lodged in his throat. As if sensing his struggle, Samantha's expression softened. "He's not yours, Matthew," she said gently, her tone steady but kind. I got back together with someone after we met. It didn't work out, but Oliver came from that." Relief washed over him, but it was tangled with confusion and a strange, hollow ache he couldn't quite place. He nodded, trying to process her words, but the tightness in his chest remained. "Right," he said, forcing a smile that felt unnatural. "I'm glad you're doing well." For a moment, Samantha's brow furrowed, as if she wanted to say more. But Oliver squirmed in her arms, letting out a small, plaintive whimper. Her attention shifted to the baby, her focus narrowing as she soothed him with practiced ease. Matthew watched her, emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. She was here, just as they'd promised, but everything felt different. The connection they'd shared a year ago seemed distant now, clouded by the reality of the separate lives they'd lived. When she looked up again, her eyes met his, and her voice was soft. "I didn't mean to throw you off. I wasn't sure if I should come tonight, but I wanted to see you." Her honesty cut through his tangled thoughts, and for all the confusion he felt, he couldn't deny that he wanted to see her too. "I'm glad you came," he said, and this time he meant it. The bar erupted into a countdown as midnight approached. Matthew and Samantha stood together, the noise and energy of the room a stark contrast to the fragile, uncertain moment they shared. When the clock struck 12, the room cheered, glasses clinked, and laughter rang out. But Matthew's focus remained fixed on Samantha and the child in her arms. "Happy New Year, Matthew," she said, her words soft and layered with meaning he couldn't fully decipher. "Happy New Year, Samantha," he replied, though the words felt heavy. As the fireworks lit up the night sky outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night was only the beginning of something far more complex than either of them had imagined. The air between them hung heavy, unspoken questions swirling like a storm. Matthew hesitated, then asked the one question he'd been avoiding. "Is he?" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, the weight of it almost too much to bear. Samantha's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, it seemed like she was considering how to answer. She let out a small breath, shaking her head. "No, Matthew," she said firmly. "He's not yours." Relief washed over him, but it was faint and fleeting. The tightness in his chest eased, but the knot in his stomach remained. "I see," he said, though he didn't. "Not entirely." Samantha adjusted Oliver in her arms, her movements deliberate and careful. "After we met, I gave things another try with someone," she explained. "It didn't work out, but Oliver came from that." Her words were measured, almost rehearsed, but there was a flicker of unease in her tone, something she couldn't quite hide. Matthew nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. He wanted to believe her, but a small voice in the back of his mind whispered questions he wasn't ready to ask. "That must have been—" He stopped, unsure how to finish the thought. "Unexpected," Samantha said, her voice softer now. "But he's my world, Matthew. He's everything." Matthew looked up at her, seeing the truth in her eyes. Whatever questions lingered, whatever doubts gnawed at him, one thing was clear. Samantha's life had changed, and so had his. The only question now was what they would do with the path that lay before them. "A lot to handle," he said, forcing himself to meet her gaze. The words felt hollow, as if he were grasping at something to say simply to fill the silence. "It is," Samantha admitted, her voice quieter now. "But he's worth it. He's everything." Matthew studied her face, searching for some trace of regret, something that might make the situation easier to understand. But all he saw was love, the kind that softened her entire being when she glanced down at Oliver. It was a love so pure it should have comforted him, should have brought him some peace. Instead, it left him feeling emptier than ever. The silence stretched, awkward and heavy, until Samantha shifted nervously. The confidence she displayed earlier seemed to waver under the weight of his unspoken thoughts. "Matthew, I should probably let you get back to your plans," he interrupted, his voice tight and restrained. Her expression fell. "I didn't come here with plans. I came to see you." Her honesty made his chest ache, but it wasn't enough to break through the storm raging inside him. "I don't think this is a good idea," he said abruptly, his words clipped and rushed. "It was nice to see you again, Samantha. Really, but I should go." For a brief moment, her face crumpled, the pain evident before she smoothed her expression into a mask of calm. Matthew wait, but he didn't wait. He couldn't. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave before he said or did something he couldn't take back. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, the cool winter air rushing to meet him as he stepped outside. The cold stung his face as he wandered aimlessly through the streets. The city lights blurred into a haze, and the echoes of celebration in the distance felt like they belonged to a different world. His thoughts spiraled, replaying the brief conversation with Samantha over and over. She had done nothing wrong. She had shown up just as she promised, and had been honest about her life. She'd given him no reason to feel hurt or betrayed. And yet, that was exactly what he felt, an inexplicable sense of loss for something that had never truly been his. Matthew stopped on a quiet street corner, leaning against a lamppost as he let out a shaky breath. He thought about turning back, apologizing, and trying to untangle the mess of emotions he didn't fully understand. But the thought of seeing Samantha again, of facing the hurt he'd caused, paralyzed him. For the first time in a long while, Matthew Cooper didn't know what to do, and that terrified him more than anything. By the time he returned to his penthouse, the city was slipping into the quiet hours of a new year. The fireworks were over, replaced by the stillness of a world at rest. But Matthew felt no such peace. His thoughts were a storm, and the silence of the penthouse only amplified the chaos in his mind. He didn't want to be alone, so he called Claire. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but concerned. "Matthew? It's late or early, I guess. Are you okay?" He hesitated before replying, his voice uneven. "I went to the bar." Claire exhaled audibly, her tone shifting to full wakefulness. "And did she show up?" "She did," he said, sinking onto the leather couch. "But it's not what I expected." "What do you mean?" Matthew closed his eyes, the memory of Samantha cradling Oliver flashing vividly in his mind. "She has a son. She said he's not mine. She got back together with someone after we met, and Oliver came from that." Claire was silent for a moment, likely choosing her words carefully. "How do you feel about that?" "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand across his face. "Confused, maybe even hurt, which doesn't make sense because she didn't owe me anything. We weren't. It was one night that clearly meant something to you," Claire pointed out gently. "You've been thinking about her for a year, Matthew. That's not nothing." Her words hit him like a weight, settling uncomfortably in his chest. He didn't respond, but the truth was undeniable. Whatever he felt for Samantha, it wasn't as simple as he'd tried to convince himself it was. And now, he wasn't sure what to do next. "And this baby?" Claire's voice was thoughtful, her words measured. "Did you believe her when she said he's not yours?" Matthew frowned, staring at the phone in his hand. "Why wouldn't I?" "I don't know," Claire replied cautiously. "But from what you've told me, Samantha doesn't strike me as someone who shows up unless it matters. Maybe there's more to the story than you realize." Leaning back in his chair, Matthew stared at the ceiling, the weight of her words pressing on him. Claire always had a way of planting seeds of doubt that refused to be ignored. He wanted to dismiss the idea outright, but the memory of Samantha's expression when she spoke lingered in his mind. There had been something there, hesitation, maybe even fear. Even if there is, he said finally, his voice low, it's not my place to push. She made her decision, and you made yours by walking away, Claire countered. But Matthew, if there's even a chance she wasn't telling the whole truth, don't you think you owe it to yourself and her to find out? The conversation ended soon after, but Claire's words stayed with him. They followed him through a restless night and into the next morning. By the time he'd showered and attempted breakfast, the gnawing feeling in his gut had only grown stronger. Across town, Samantha sat on her couch, sunlight streaming through the windows. It did little to ease the heaviness in her chest. Oliver dozed in her lap, his tiny breath steady and rhythmic, but her mind was anything but calm. She replayed the events of the night before, every detail of her encounter with Matthew vivid and unrelenting. She convinced herself that seeing him again would bring clarity, that their connection would make the messy complications of her life feel manageable. Instead, it had only left her feeling more lost. Lying to him about Oliver's paternity had felt like her only choice. Matthew's life was so far removed from hers, built on precision, power, and wealth. She couldn't imagine dragging him into the chaos of single parenthood. But when she'd seen him standing there, so familiar yet distant, something inside her had ached. She wanted to tell him the truth, that Oliver was his, that their brief connection had led to something extraordinary and unexpected. But fear had kept her silent. Now, as Oliver stirred in her arms, blinking up at her with wide, trusting eyes, guilt twisted inside her. He deserved to know his father, and Matthew deserved the truth. Yet how could she risk it when Matthew had already walked away? Later that afternoon, Matthew sat in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the number, unfamiliar but local. After a brief hesitation, he answered, "Hello, Matthew Cooper?" The voice was hesitant but clear. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Rachel," she said, her tone steady but cautious. "I'm a friend of Samantha's." Matthew straightened in his chair, his pulse quickening. "How did you get my number?" "Samantha mentioned you once," Rachel admitted. "And well, I found your company's website. I hope you don't mind me calling." He didn't respond, unsure of what to make of this intrusion. The silence stretched before Rachel continued. "I don't want to overstep," she said carefully, "but I felt like you needed to know something. Last night, after Samantha came home, she seemed really upset. She didn't tell me much, but I know her well enough to see when she's holding something back." Matthew frowned, his grip tightening on the phone. "What are you trying to say?" Rachel hesitated before blurting it out. "Matthew, Oliver is your son. Samantha's scared to tell you, but I thought you deserved to know." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "What?" His voice was sharp, disbelief mingling with anger. "How do you know that?" "She told me when she found out she was pregnant," Rachel said softly. "She was terrified, Matthew. She didn't know if you'd want to be involved, or even if she should tell you. But I think it's eating her up inside." Matthew's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The timeline, the hesitation in Samantha's eyes, the guarded way she'd spoken the night before. It all made sense now. "I don't know why she didn't tell you," Rachel added, her tone almost pleading. "But if you care about her, and about Oliver, you need to talk to her." The call ended, leaving Matthew standing alone in his office, the phone trembling in his hand. His heart pounded, his emotions a chaotic mix of shock, anger, and something deeper he couldn't yet name. He thought back to Samantha's words, to the way her eyes had darted away when she said Oliver wasn't his. She had lied, and now he didn't know if he could forgive her, or if he even wanted to. But more than fear, she'd been paralyzed by uncertainty, unsure of how Matthew would respond, unsure of what his presence might mean for both her and Oliver. Standing in his office, staring at the city lights, Matthew knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away again, not without knowing the truth. The next morning, Matthew found himself standing outside Samantha's apartment building, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. The echoes of New Year's celebrations had faded, replaced by the quieter hum of everyday life. Yet for Matthew, everything felt electrified. He stared at the worn brass buzzer, his nerves taut. Rachel's words had replayed in his mind all night, leaving him sleepless and restless. He wasn't sure how he'd feel when he finally saw Samantha and Oliver again, but he knew he needed answers, needed clarity. Finally, he pressed the buzzer labeled S. Grayson. A crackle on the intercom, and then her voice, cautious and familiar. "Hello, it's Matthew," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Can we talk?" There was a long pause, and for a moment, he thought she might send him away. But then the door buzzed, and he stepped inside. When Samantha opened the door, Oliver was in her arms, his wide eyes brimming with curiosity. Samantha looked tired, her hair pulled into a loose bun, but there was still warmth in her cautious expression. "Matthew," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't expecting you. I wasn't planning to come," he admitted, his gaze flickering to Oliver before meeting hers. "But we need to talk." Her arms tightened instinctively around her son as she hesitated, then nodded. "All right." The apartment was modest but inviting, with soft colors and toys scattered across the floor. It was a sharp contrast to his minimalist penthouse, and yet it felt more alive than his home had in years. Matthew sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I know." Samantha froze, her expression shifting to one of guarded tension. "Know what?" "About Oliver," he said firmly, though his tone was kind. "I know he's my son, Samantha." Her face paled, and she sank into the chair opposite him, holding Oliver close as though he might slip away. "Who told you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Does it matter?" he replied softly. "You should have told me, Samantha. Why didn't you?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked away, her fingers brushing lightly over Oliver's dark curls. "I was scared," she admitted after a long pause. "When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. Your life is so different from mine, Matthew. You've built this empire, and I'm just me. I didn't want to complicate your life." "You think I wouldn't have wanted to know?" he asked, his voice catching. "You think I wouldn't have wanted to be there for you, for him?" "I didn't know," she said, tears spilling over. "You lost Isabel. I saw the pain in your eyes when we met. I didn't want to add to that, or worse, be rejected. So I convinced myself it was better this way. Safer." Matthew exhaled, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't deny that she had a point. His life was far from ordinary, and his grief after Isabel's death had been consuming. But that didn't change the fact that he'd missed the first months of his son's life. "I wish you'd given me the chance to decide," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because I would have been here, Samantha. No matter what." Her sobs broke through then, quiet but heart-wrenching, as Oliver squirmed in her arms. Matthew leaned forward, his hand brushing hers in a gesture of comfort. It was a small touch, but it seemed to steady her. Slowly, her breathing evened out. "I'm sorry," she said, meeting his gaze with tear-filled eyes. "I should have told you. I was wrong." Matthew nodded, his chest tightening. "We can't change the past," he said, glancing at Oliver, who now gazed at him with wide, curious eyes. "But we could figure out where to go from here." In the weeks that followed, Matthew's world shifted. He began spending more time with Samantha and Oliver, navigating a life that was unfamiliar but unexpectedly fulfilling. It started small, short visits where he learned how to hold Oliver properly or discovered that silly faces could elicit the most infectious giggles. But as the days turned into weeks, his bond with his son deepened. The way Oliver's tiny hand curled around his finger, the way his laughter filled the room like sunlight. These moments became the foundation of a new purpose in Matthew's life. Samantha, too, began to let her guard down. Her wariness softened into trust as she saw Matthew's commitment, not just to Oliver, but to the life they were tentatively building together. For the first time in years, Matthew felt whole, not because his life had returned to what it once was, but because it had grown into something new, something he hadn't realized he needed. And as he held Oliver one quiet evening, his son's small hand resting against his chest, Matthew knew this was just the beginning. She watched as Matthew eased into fatherhood, her heart softening a little more with each passing day. Every time he cradled Oliver or coaxed a giggle from their son, Samantha felt her walls begin to crack. But no matter how much joy their growing closeness brought, a part of her still held back, wary of letting herself hope too much. One evening, as they sat on the living room floor, surrounded by a scattering of toys and Oliver's cheerful babbling, Samantha finally gave voice to her fears. "I don't want you to feel obligated, Matthew," she said, her voice hesitant. "To be here, to be with us?" Matthew stilled, his gaze steady as he looked at her. "Obligated?" he repeated, the word heavy on his tongue. "Samantha, I'm here because I want to be, because this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." She offered a faint smile, but didn't reply. The doubts still lingered beneath her expression, shadows that seemed to brace her for an inevitable disappointment. Matthew could see it in her eyes, the way she flinched at the idea of trusting him fully, the way her guard never entirely came down. As much as he wanted to reassure her, he understood that words wouldn't be enough. Not this time. He'd have to prove it, not only to Samantha, but to himself. Balancing his demanding career with the responsibilities of fatherhood wasn't easy. His days became a careful dance, split between high-stakes investor meetings and afternoons spent building block towers with Oliver. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him, when he wondered if he was doing enough or if he was in over his head. But then Oliver would reach for him with those tiny, trusting hands, or Samantha would smile at him with that quiet, knowing expression, and suddenly, the pressure didn't feel so impossible. Yet the tension between them remained, unspoken but ever-present. Samantha was still afraid to fully trust, and Matthew couldn't blame her. He hadn't made it easy, but one thing he knew for certain, he wasn't going to walk away. Not from Samantha, and not from Oliver. The weeks turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm. Matthew divided his time between his penthouse and Samantha's apartment, building a bond with his son that deepened with each visit. Oliver had started recognizing him, his face lighting up with a gummy smile whenever Matthew walked through the door. That simple joy filled a void Matthew hadn't realized he'd carried since losing Isabel. But as their connection grew, so did the cracks in the fragile arrangement between him and Samantha. For all the laughter and shared moments, there was a tension between them that neither could ignore. One evening, as Oliver napped in his crib, they sat together at the kitchen table. The conversation had started light, but took a sharper turn when Matthew broached the subject of Oliver's future. "I've been looking into schools," Matthew said, his tone casual, though his words carried weight. "There's an early learning center near my place. It's one of the best in the city." Samantha looked up from her tea, her brows furrowing slightly. "Your place?" "Yes," Matthew replied, leaning forward slightly. "It would make sense. It's closer to my office, and they have resources Oliver could really benefit from." We? Samantha interrupted, her voice sharp with surprise. "Matthew, are you suggesting that Oliver and I move into your world?" Matthew paused, sensing the tension in her tone. "Not immediately," he said carefully, "but we should start thinking long-term. Oliver deserves the best opportunities, and I can provide that." Samantha set her cup down, her expression tightening. "I appreciate that you want what's best for Oliver, but we're doing fine here." "Fine?" Matthew echoed, frustration edging into his voice. "Samantha, this isn't about fine. It's about giving Oliver every advantage, every opportunity to thrive. And you think I can't do that?" she snapped, her voice rising. "Just because I don't live in a penthouse or run a billion-dollar company doesn't mean I can't give my son a good life." "That's not what I'm saying," Matthew countered, his voice steady but firm. "Then what are you saying?" Samantha shot back, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. Matthew exhaled, forcing himself to rein in his frustration. "I'm saying we need to work together. I'm not trying to take over, Samantha. I just want to make sure Oliver has everything he could possibly need." "He already does," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He has me, and now he has you. Isn't that enough?" Matthew hesitated, the weight of her words settling over him. In her eyes, he saw not just fear, but a fierce determination to protect the life she'd built for Oliver. And for the first time, he realized that Samantha wasn't just afraid of losing control. She was afraid of losing herself. "It is," Matthew said finally, his voice softer now. "But I want to be part of this, Samantha. Not just for Oliver, but for you too. And I need you to trust that I'm not going anywhere." Samantha blinked, the fire in her gaze dimming as his words sank in. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a fragile thread. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we do this together. On my terms too." Matthew smiled faintly. "Together," he agreed. And as Oliver stirred in his crib, his soft cries breaking the quiet, Matthew and Samantha shared a look that carried something new, something fragile but hopeful. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "But you can't deny that I can offer him things you can't." Samantha's eyes flashed with anger as she stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen. "And there it is," she said bitterly. "The power imbalance. The control. You think just because you have money, you get to dictate how we live?" Matthew rose to his feet, frustration boiling over. "This isn't about control, Samantha. It's about being practical, about planning for the future." "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's about you trying to fit us into your world, your way, without considering how that might feel for me." Matthew stepped closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "You think this is easy for me? I'm trying, Samantha. I'm trying to be here for Oliver, for you. But every time I take a step forward, you push me back. What are you so afraid of?" She froze, his words cutting through her like a blade. Her eyes locked on his, a storm of anger and pain swirling within them. "You want to know what I'm afraid of, Matthew?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I'm afraid of getting used to you being here, only for you to decide one day that it's too much. That we're too much. That's not going to happen," Matthew said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." "You say that now," she snapped, tears glistening in her eyes. "But you have no idea what this life is like, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices. And I won't let Oliver grow up thinking he's someone's obligation." Matthew's chest tightened at her words, the accusation slicing deep. "Is that what you think? That I'm here out of obligation?" "I don't know what to think," she admitted, the tears spilling over as she wiped them away angrily. "All I know is that this is my life, and I've been doing just fine without you. I don't need you to swoop in and take over." The weight of her words settled heavily between them, neither speaking for a long moment. Finally, Samantha turned away, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I think you should go." Matthew's instincts screamed at him to stay, to fight for her, for Oliver. But the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was fear, raw and unguarded. "Samantha," he started, his voice softer now. "Please," she said, shaking her head, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Just go." He hesitated, his feet feeling like lead. But eventually, he turned and walked toward the door. Every step felt like a betrayal, a breaking of the promise he'd made to himself not to leave. When he reached the door, he glanced back, hoping for some sign that she might change her mind. But Samantha had turned away, her posture rigid, her pain palpable. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, and Matthew stood in the hallway, his heart heavier than it had been in years. He wanted to go back, to fix what had just broken, but he knew it wasn't that simple. Samantha's walls had been built long before he entered her life, and breaking through them would take more than words. The days that followed were some of the longest Matthew had experienced in years. He moved through the motions of work, meetings, contracts, decisions, his mind always elsewhere. The memory of Samantha, her face streaked with tears, haunted him. Her words echoed relentlessly in his head, each one a reminder of how much he'd failed to reach her. Each night, he returned to his penthouse and sat alone, the silence of his home now unbearable. It wasn't just Samantha's absence that gnawed at him. It was Oliver's, his son. The thought still filled him with awe, and now, with an ache he couldn't ignore. One evening, while rifling through a drawer in his bedroom, His hand brushed against something unfamiliar. Pulling it out, he found a folded piece of paper, its edges worn with time. It took him a moment to remember where it had come from. The bar. It was one of the notes Samantha had slipped into his coat pocket on the night they'd met. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, the faded ink scrawled in her delicate handwriting. Matthew, I don't know if we'll ever meet again, but if we don't, I just want to say thank you. For listening, for laughing, for helping me remember that life can still surprise me. He stared at the note, her words sinking deep into his heart. They had been written in a different time, before Oliver, before the complications that now surrounded them. But the sentiment still rang true. Life could still surprise him. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to show Samantha that he meant every word he'd said, that he wasn't going anywhere. I hope you find happiness again. You deserve it. Samantha. The note was short, simple, but it hit Matthew like a tidal wave. He could see her as though she were standing in front of him that night at the bar. Her smile had been tentative but genuine, a mix of vulnerability and hope. She had been unsure of her future, yet brave enough to reach out and connect. She had believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. Matthew set the note down on the desk, his chest tightening as emotions swirled within him. He had been so focused on his own fears, rejection, failure, the suffocating thought that he wasn't enough, that he hadn't stopped to think about how much courage it had taken for Samantha to let him into her life. And when she needed him to prove he was there for the long haul, he'd walked away. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as clarity settled over him. Samantha had been afraid, yes, but so had he. If he truly wanted to build a life with her and Oliver, he couldn't keep waiting for her to trust him completely. He had to show her, really show her, that he wasn't going anywhere. Across town, Samantha sat on the couch, watching Oliver shake a soft rattle in his small hands. His laughter rang out, filling the apartment with warmth, but it carried a bittersweet undertone she couldn't ignore. Matthew's absence was palpable. She had convinced herself that asking him to leave was for the best, that she was protecting herself and Oliver from disappointment. But as the days turned into weeks, regret gnawed at her. Matthew had been there for them in ways she never expected. He had been patient, kind, and present, and she had pushed him away, not because he failed her, but because she was afraid of losing him. Running a hand through her hair, she sighed deeply. Her thoughts returned to the moments Matthew had spent with Oliver, the way he held their son like he was the most precious thing in the world. He hadn't just shown up out of obligation. He'd cared. For both of them, her heart ached as the truth settled in. She had let her fears blind her to the life they could have been building together. The turning point came when her phone buzzed, interrupting her spiral of thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a message from Rachel. "How long are you going to wait? He's not perfect, Sam, but neither are you. And that's okay. You two love that baby more than anything. Maybe it's time to admit you're better together than apart." Samantha stared at the message, her throat tightening. Rachel's words hit her squarely. She had been so focused on protecting herself from heartbreak that she hadn't stopped to see how much pain she was causing, both Matthew and herself. It was time to stop running. For Matthew, the note was the catalyst for his resolve. He stopped waiting for the right moment and decided to create one instead. He spent days planning, unsure of how Samantha might react, but certain that he had to try. The opportunity came on a crisp February afternoon. Samantha was walking back to her apartment, Oliver bundled warmly in his stroller. As she approached the building, her breath caught in her throat. Matthew was there. He stood near the entrance, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. For a brief moment, she thought about turning around, but then their eyes met. "Samantha," he said as she approached, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Can we talk?" She nodded, her pulse quickening as they stepped inside. Oliver, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, remained unusually quiet as they settled into the living room. Matthew took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice steady despite the raw emotion beneath it. "For walking away, for not listening, for letting my own fears get in the way." Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand. "Please let me finish," he said. I've spent weeks thinking about what I want, and it all comes back to you and Oliver. You're my family, Samantha, and I don't care about the challenges or the complications. I'm here because I want to be, because I love you." The words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Samantha's breath caught, and her vision blurred with tears. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And I'm sorry for pushing you away. I was scared, Matthew. Scared of losing you. Scared of letting myself hope. But I don't want to be scared anymore." Matthew reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You don't have to be," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Samantha looked at him, her heart finally daring to believe. The days that followed marked the beginning of something new. They weren't without challenges, but Samantha and Matthew faced them together. For the first time, Samantha allowed herself to hope, and for the first time in years, Matthew felt truly at home. Not in the towering walls of his penthouse, but in the laughter of his son and the love of the woman who had helped him find himself again. "We'll figure it out together." And in that moment, as Oliver cooed happily between them, Samantha and Matthew both knew they had taken the first step toward a future worth fighting for. The weeks following Matthew's heartfelt confession brought a newfound calm to their fragile bond. The uncertainty that had once loomed over their relationship began to dissolve, replaced by steady growth and quiet moments of joy. Matthew spent more time at Samantha's apartment, helping with Oliver and sharing evenings filled with laughter and conversation. Samantha, too, found herself letting her guard down, allowing the idea of a future with Matthew to take root. Still, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more. Samantha deserved not just reassurances, but tangible proof that she and Oliver were the most important parts of his life. The opportunity came in mid-March, on Samantha's birthday. Matthew had overheard her mention the date in passing and immediately began planning. Her birthday, he decided, was the perfect moment to make his feelings undeniably clear. The morning of her birthday dawned crisp and bright. Samantha woke to the sound of Oliver babbling happily in his crib, his tiny hands waving in the air. She scooped him up, pressing a kiss to his forehead, her heart swelling with love. Though her days were quieter now, they were filled with joy, especially with Matthew's presence in her life. But as she settled into the day, she couldn't help but wonder what, if anything, the day would bring. By late afternoon, as she sat on the couch watching Oliver play, a knock at the door startled her. Curious, she opened it, holding Oliver on her hip. Matthew stood there, his arms overflowing with flowers, balloons, and a large wrap box. His slightly nervous smile only made him more endearing. "Happy birthday, Samantha," he said, his voice warm and genuine. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she let out a soft laugh. "Matthew, what is all this?" "This," he said, stepping inside and carefully setting down the gifts, "is me trying to make up for not knowing it was your birthday last year. And also because you deserve to be celebrated." Samantha shook her head, smiling. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," he replied, his expression softening. "But I wanted to." As she set Oliver down to crawl among his toys, Matthew reached for her hands, his gaze steady and his voice earnest. "Samantha," he began, "I know I've made mistakes. I let my fears get in the way of what really matters. But I need you to know that I love you. I love Oliver, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Whatever it takes, I'm here. For both of you." Tears welled in Samantha's eyes as she listened, her heart swelling with emotions she had been too scared to name. Matthew's words weren't just promises. They were the culmination of months of his unwavering presence and quiet dedication. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And I'm sorry for doubting you. You've been patient and kind, and Her voice broke as a tear slipped down her cheek. Matthew gently wiped it away, pulling her into his arms. For a long moment, they simply held each other, the weight of their past struggles giving way to something lighter, something stronger. Oliver, as if sensing the shift, let out a delighted giggle, clapping his tiny hands. "Well, I think he approves," Matthew said with a grin. Samantha laughed, her smile wide and genuine. "I think so too." The rest of the day was a blur of warmth and laughter. Matthew insisted on cooking dinner, though Samantha eventually stepped in to save the sauce he nearly burned. They spent the evening playing with Oliver, sharing stories, and basking in the simple joy of each other's company. For the first time in years, Samantha felt a deep sense of ease. As the months passed, the three of them fell into an easy rhythm, one that felt more and more like a family with each passing day. Matthew adjusted his demanding work schedule, carving out time to be present for Samantha and Oliver. Samantha, in turn, began to imagine a future that no longer felt precarious or uncertain. By the time New Year's Eve rolled around, their lives had transformed in ways neither could have anticipated. When Matthew suggested they return to the bar where their journey began, Samantha shook her head, her hand resting lightly on his. "Why don't we spend it here?" she suggested. "Just the three of us?" Matthew smiled, his heart full. "I like that." That evening, they prepared a small celebration at Samantha's apartment. Matthew dressed Oliver in a tiny suit he had insisted on buying, and Samantha couldn't remember the last time she had laughed so much. They played music, danced with Oliver in their arms, and shared quiet moments reflecting on the whirlwind of the past year. As midnight approached, they huddled together, Oliver nestled between them. When the clock struck 12, Matthew kissed Samantha softly, his hand resting on her cheek. "Happy New Year," he whispered. "Happy New Year," she replied, her voice filled with hope. And as fireworks lit up the night sky outside, Samantha and Matthew knew they had built something real, something lasting. A family. As midnight approached, Samantha and Matthew stood by the window, watching the city skyline come alive with vibrant bursts of fireworks. Oliver nestled in Matthew's arms, his wide eyes captivated by the flashes of color dancing across the night sky. Matthew turned to Samantha, his expression soft with gratitude and love. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of meaning. "For what?" Samantha asked, tilting her head as a gentle smile played on her lips. "For giving me this," he replied, gesturing to the three of them. "For trusting me. For letting me in." Samantha's smile widened as she reached up, her hand gently cupping his cheek. "Thank you for proving I could." As the clock struck midnight, their lips met in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future yet to unfold. Fireworks illuminated the small apartment, casting a warm, golden glow around them. For the first time in years, the future felt bright, full of love, hope, and endless possibilities. The glow of fireworks painted the room with fleeting flashes of red, gold, and silver as Samantha leaned her head against Matthew's shoulder, her fingers brushing lightly against his. Oliver dozed peacefully in Matthew's arms, his tiny hand curled around the edge of his blanket. "This is perfect," Samantha murmured, her voice soft with contentment. "I don't think I've ever had a New Year's Eve like this." "Neither have I," Matthew replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her hair. His gaze drifted to the window, the fireworks reflecting in his eyes. "You know, I've been thinking about where we were 2 years ago." Samantha tilted her head to look at him, her expression curious. "The bars." He nodded, a wistful smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, I was sitting there, wondering if showing up had been the biggest mistake of my life. And then you saw me," she said with a teasing smile. Matthew chuckled. "And then I saw you. I had no idea that one night would lead to this." His eyes dropped to Oliver, who stirred slightly in his arms before settling back into sleep. "Neither did I," Samantha admitted, her voice softening. She hesitated for a moment before adding, "I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. To the bar, I mean." Matthew turned to her, his brows lifting slightly. "Why not?" "I guess I was afraid it wouldn't feel the same," she said honestly. "That it might take away from everything we've built since then." Matthew reached for her hand, brushing his thumb gently over her knuckles. "It's not about going back. It's about celebrating where we started and how far we've come." Samantha considered his words, her eyes searching his before she nodded. "I like that," she said softly. "It could be our tradition." "Our tradition," Matthew repeated with a smile, the words settling warmly between them. The following New Year's Eve arrived on a cold, snowy night, the city streets shimmering under a soft blanket of frost. Samantha adjusted Oliver's tiny hat, securing it snugly as she bundled him into his stroller. Matthew, scarf draped loosely around his neck, stepped outside to join them. He crouched to tuck the blanket around Oliver more securely before straightening and meeting Samantha's gaze with a smile. "Ready?" he asked, his breath visible in the frosty air. Samantha nodded, her heart warming despite the chill. "Let's do this." The bar was just as they remembered it, cozy and unassuming, tucked into a quiet corner of the bustling city. The warm glow of its lights spilled onto the sidewalk, and the low hum of music reached them before they even stepped inside. Matthew held the door open for Samantha, his hand lightly resting on her back as she walked in. The familiar mix of laughter, conversation, and clinking glasses filled the air, wrapping them in a sense of nostalgia. Samantha smiled as memories of their first meeting washed over her. The tentative way they had spoken, the easy connection that had followed, and the promise they had made without knowing where it might lead. Matthew led them to a table near the back, where the noise was softer and they could talk without interruption. As they settled in, Oliver stirred in his stroller, letting out a small, curious coo. Samantha reached for him, cradling him gently as Matthew leaned closer, his eyes warm with affection. "To new beginnings," Matthew said, raising his glass. "And to honoring where it all started," Samantha added, clinking her glass softly against his. As midnight approached once more, the three of them sat together, their hearts full and their laughter easy. This time, the promise they made wasn't unspoken. It was clear, steady, and filled with the certainty that they had found their way home, to each other. He helped Samantha settle Oliver, who was now wide awake, his wide, curious eyes soaking in the vibrant sights and sounds of the bar. "This feels surreal," Samantha said, glancing around. Her voice carried a mix of nostalgia and wonder. "Being back here. But so much has changed." Matthew reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers with ease. "In the best way," he replied, his voice warm and steady. "A year ago, I didn't think I'd ever feel this kind of happiness again. And now," his words trailed off as his gaze fell to Oliver, who let out a joyful squeal as though he agreed. Samantha laughed softly, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had never expected this, a life filled with such love and safety. But Matthew had made it possible step by patient step. The night unfolded in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. They shared stories, laughter flowing freely as they recounted memories, both old and recent. When Matthew tried to order the same drink he'd had the night they met, Samantha teased him for getting it wrong. Meanwhile, Oliver quickly became the center of attention, charming everyone who passed by their table with his infectious giggles and bright eyes. As the countdown to midnight began, Matthew wrapped an arm around Samantha's shoulders, pulling her close as they stood together amidst the celebration. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Do you remember what you said to me that night?" he asked, his voice low. Samantha tilted her head, her eyes dancing with playful mischief. "You mean when I told you looked like you needed that drink more than I did?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Not that. At the end of the night, the promise we made," her smile softened, a touch of sentimentality flickering across her face. "If we were still single, we'd meet here again," she murmured. "And here we are," Matthew said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "But not as strangers. As a family." Tears pricked at the corners of Samantha's eyes, and she reached up to cradle his cheek in her palm. "I never thought I'd find this again," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never thought I'd find you." "You didn't just find me," Matthew said, his gaze steady and full of love. "You saved me." As the clock struck midnight, their lips met in a kiss that felt different from any they had shared before. It wasn't a hope for what might be. It was a celebration of all they had built together. Oliver squealed in delight, breaking the spell and drawing them both back to the present. They laughed together, turning their attention to him as he clapped his tiny hands in excitement, clearly enthralled by the energy of the moment. Matthew leaned down, brushing a tender kiss against Oliver's forehead. "Happy New Year, buddy," he said softly. Samantha rested her head against Matthew's shoulder, watching the fireworks outside as they illuminated the night sky. Her heart was full, her spirit at peace. This was their new tradition, one they had created together, and in that moment, she knew with certainty that they had everything they needed. They had love, they had hope, they had each other. As the fireworks lit up the sky and another new year began, Matthew, Samantha, and Oliver stood together as a family. They celebrated not only the moment, but the incredible journey that had brought them there. Their story was a testament to the beauty of second chances, the courage to embrace vulnerability, and the joy of building new traditions. What began as a fleeting encounter had blossomed into a profound bond that would carry them through all the years ahead. Thank you for being part of this heartfelt journey. If this story touched you, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more tales of love, resilience, and the unexpected twists life brings. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What was your favorite part of Matthew and Samantha's journey? And what traditions do you hold dear with your loved ones? Here's to new beginnings, cherished connections, and a future filled with endless possibilities. We'll see you in the next story. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of Matthew, Samantha, and Oliver. From a chance meeting in a quiet bar to navigating the challenges of love and trust, they found the courage to build a new family filled with hope and unconditional love. Their story is not just about romance. It's a testament to the power of second chances, resilience, and the beauty of creating something meaningful together. Life may take us on unexpected paths, but it's often those very twists and turns that lead us to where we're truly meant to be. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about love, growth, and the surprises life has in store. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What was your favorite part of Matthew and Samantha's journey? And what family traditions do you cherish most?